Hi there, Gateway Church family, and welcome to episode 5 of our series called Worship Basics, where we are learning about the basics of worship. It's been an exciting journey so far, looking at worship and how powerful worship is within our lives and within church life. In this episode, we're going to look at how worship connects us with God. We've seen why we worship, but you might say, how does it actually connect us with the Lord? Well, first of all, the Bible tells us that worship, it helps us to open up our hearts to God's presence. When we worship, our perspective shifts from ourselves to God, from our troubles and our struggles to God. We begin to see the greatness of our God. As we worship, our hearts begin to open to God's presence. Worship invites God into our lives. It invites him into our experiences. When we begin to worship, we're saying, Lord, I'm fixing my eyes on you. Come and help me. Come and save me. Come and rescue me. It's a way where we draw near to the Lord. I love what it says in Psalm 22 and verse 3. Yet you are holy, enthroned on the praises of Israel. Other translations of that says, God inhabits the praises of his people. You know, when we begin to worship, we create an atmosphere where God is welcomed, where we can sense his tangible presence in a real and powerful way. That can happen in church on Sundays, but it can also happen wherever you are. Worship invites God into our lives. It opens up our hearts to his presence. Secondly, as we begin to worship, worship helps us to surrender and to trust the Lord as well. After all, worship is an act of surrender. We worship God with all that we are. You know, when we worship, we begin to acknowledge that God is in control of our lives, that Jesus is Lord of all, not just Lord of part of our lives. As we begin to worship, we can begin to trust God. Our trust for him begins to develop. It helps us to let go of our worries, let go of our fears, let go of anything that might be holding us back. When we worship, we focus on God's goodness and his trustworthiness. We can trust in the Lord. He is faithful. Proverbs chapter 3, verse 5 to 6 says, trust in the Lord with all your heart. Do not depend on your own understanding. Seek his will in all you do, and he will show you which path to take. Worship, it strengthens our trust in God. It helps us to rely on his wisdom and on his guidance. Thirdly, worship, it helps us to align with God's will. Worship isn't just about experiencing feelings. I want you to know that it's so much more than just having emotions or expressing or just feeling different things. But worship helps us to align with God's heart. We begin to sense what God's heart is for our lives, what his heart beats for. As we worship God, we begin to focus on the character of God. We become more aware of his desires for our lives. Worship, it changes our attitudes. It changes our character. It helps us see things from God's perspective. Romans chapter 12 verse 2 says, don't copy the behavior and customs of this world, but let God transform you into a new person by changing the way you think. Then you will learn to know God's will for you, which is good and pleasing and perfect. Worship changes us from the inside out. It helps us to grow to become the people that God has created us to be. And finally, worship, it fills us with joy. It fills us with God's peace. That's what happens when we worship. We are reminded of God's love for us. We're reminded of the promises of God, which can bring so much peace and strength to our hearts. Worship helps us to experience God's comfort. It helps us to experience the hope of God, even in difficult times. There have been so many times where I felt low, where I felt defeated, where I felt broken. But I began to worship, I began to sing, I began to thank God, and that just lifted my spirit. That's what can happen. God lifts our heads, as it says in the Psalms. He's the glory and the lifter of our heads. That's what happens when we worship. We look to our God, and God lifts our heads, and we can see he is above all things. Our life is in his hands, and nothing is too hard for our God. It says in Psalm 16, verse 11, you will show me the way of life, granting me the joy of your presence and the pleasures of living with you forever. Worship connects us with the joy, with the peace that only God can provide. It renews our hearts and minds. So I want to encourage you, make worship a priority. Make it a part of your daily routine. When you worship, begin to surrender your worries, your cares to the Lord. Sing a song, declare the promises of God. Begin to pray, surrender your life to the Lord and allow him to minister to you, and focus on his character, focus on the strength, the power, the goodness, the might of our God. He reigns over all. He's the resurrected King. He is above all things, and he is for you. He is not against you. As we come to a conclusion, worship, it helps us to connect with God in a powerful way. Not only can we minister to the Lord, but God begins to minister to us. We experience his presence as we surrender to him. We know his presence. We can experience his peace and his joy. We begin to discover his heart, his plan, and his good purpose for our lives. When we worship, we draw close with the Lord, and we begin to see God work powerfully within our lives. I want to encourage you, keep worshiping the Lord, because it'll help you get connected to the Lord and experience him in a deeper and greater way.